Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the National Press Club, with History Happens. We're here for a very special event tonight. That's this book, Teardrop Diplomacy, by Sri Lanka Foray. This book details how a democratically elected regime turned into an autocracy within a very short time period. Joining us to discuss this book is Mr. Jeffrey Payne, who's a research fellow, academic affairs manager at the National Defense University Near East South Asia Center for Studies. Sitting next to me, Mr. Jerome, co-founder and CEO of the Millennium Project, and of course, the star of the evening, Asanga, author of this book and the senior fellow the Millennium Project, and also a for the National Press Club. Okay, so, you want to start, Jeffrey?
Sure, absolutely. Good evening, everyone. Great to be here with Asanga, my friend, a longtime collaborator with NISA. It's easier to say that than the Near East South Asia Center for Strategic Studies. I'm within the DoD, so we acronym everything. So I heard a comment earlier about there are a lot of acronyms in the book. Actually, in my experience, not that many. In terms of this, I just want to emphasize some of the overarching points from my viewpoint and what we do at the NISA Center. So I'm a maritime geek and also have been worked on China for 20 years. And essentially the chronicle of China's kind of outward expansion in the financial and economic development realm prior to the BRI and then after the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative is being chronicled in a lot of ways, but it's always from this geostrategic 30,000 foot vantage point, and usually from the point of the West, vis-a-vis strategic competition. What this book kind of emphasizes is the chronicle of what occurred in a specific country that was needing these investments for certain types of infrastructural development. But then the inherent problem with China's economic largesse, and that is that their financial sector is insanely opaque to the point where we don't know how much fluidity their banks have, let alone how their international structures actually work in terms of deals. And Sri Lanka fell victim to that to a degree, but also chronicled in the book is the regional as well as the internal politics of Sri Lanka itself, which is a variable that is often excluded. And so one of the lessons that I took from this book, not only is it a chronicle of, if you want to understand what happened in Sri Lanka and how it happened, read it, but more importantly than that, from an overt, unapologetic US point of view, is the Biden administration's tilt towards listening to regional partners and allies means understanding what's going on and what the needs are of the region itself. And so this book gives an example of essentially how China, either because of its own kind of motivation or because it saw a gap, was first past the post. The US, other kind of predominant international donors didn't show up to the same degree. And that is a lesson that can be chronicled from this book. But the final comment I'll make before closing down and moving on to the star of the show is this also signals, I think, something very, very important right now, which is the world is now grown accustomed to China's presence around the world. And the way China operates is now getting its backlash. Especially the Western press is emphasizing more and more and more what these deals incur. What happens if you default on a debt like Sri Lanka? How do we get the Chinese to be transparent in that process so that the IMF or the World Bank or another bilateral donor can assist with the easement of debt? And then also the repercussions internally for a country like Sri Lanka in understanding the long-term implications of some of these projects. So with that, it was a pleasure to read it. It was a pleasure to join you here tonight, and look forward to the conversation.
as they say in the House of Representatives, I yield my time. What I'd rather do, if I may, is let Asanga is the starter, and have him talk, and maybe I can add 2 cents at the end.
Thank you. Thanks, Poonam. Thank you so much for all that you've done for this event. And thank you, Jeff, as well as Jerry, taking your time. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending to that. I'll just give you a brief on what I have sort of captured in my book, and the time frame that I've sort of looked from 2019 to 2022. It's a regime of president called Gotabaya Rajapaksa. Now, you would get confused with the Rajapaksa because you would wonder which one that I'm talking about. It's normal because there are so many Rajapaksa ruled, as well as we had a sibling regime. 2 brothers were ruling the country for the first time in Sri Lankan political history. And then we had several other brothers also in the other ministries, the key ministries, the finance ministry, etc. So to navigate what's in the book, so the publisher told me, like, why don't you put up a graph like a family tree? So there's a family tree behind that you can first have a look at that and then start reading the book, because those who are not familiar to Sri Lanka will find it difficult. If you are more interested about Sri Lanka, what happened in the past, starting from 2015, I've captured my initial book, which is Sri Lanka at Crossroads. So prior to what happened in 2015, so with the Ilam War victory, one of the Rajapaksas gained victory from the war, and then what happened to the regime of that, ending in 2015. The next book is Conundrum of an Island, so starting from 2015 to 19. And this one continues in 2019. So it's kind of a sequence. If you want to know more about Sri Lanka, so I would recommend you having a look at that. This particular book, half of the book was written in Sri Lanka, and the other half was in Washington, D.C., where I served in the Millennium project as senior fellow. So interaction with Jerry, as well as many others in Washington. And I kind of saw a perspective from Washington looking at Sri Lanka. So it's kind of initially from Sri Lanka as a field researcher looking for USAID. I carried out more than 70 interviews and I captured data. And when I came here, one of the first projects I got was from Asia Society, ASPI, where they said they're working on a Belt and Road toolkit. What is the toolkit? So it's to improve Chinese project. We need some help, and are you interested? So I can post. So I got onto the project, and then start again capturing data from Washington, using few of my field researchers in Sri Lanka. For example, going into Chinese projects like the Port City project, which is a massive development. Interviewing stakeholders like the fisheries community, have they been consulted? The environmental experts, have they been consulted? So what we found was the data, it's all in this book. So basically I've captured, none of those EIAs were properly done, the environmental impact assessment. The fisheries community was never consulted. They were not even compensated. So we've interviewed the head, I mean, basically chairman of the fisheries community. So going into sort of the various stakeholders, Hambantota project is another big project to discuss. Hambantota was highlighted throughout the book about the 99-year lease, and what China was trying to sort of, China leased it, the port 99 years, when Sri Lanka couldn't pay its debt. And the large amount of borrowings can see, starting from, regime to regime, and then accelerated. And all these loans had a problem of opaqueness, non-transparency, and then high interest rates. Some of the loans were on 6.2%. Then comes the discussion where I bring in sort of India's view on this project, how New Delhi sees as a strategic threat, security threat, because there's no returns, number one, from these projects as expected. And then there is sort of a hidden dimension, a strategic dimension. So that's where I begin my geopolitics chapter. So the first chapter is about China and Sri Lanka. The second is about geopolitics. So the geopolitics chapter, I kind of argue and sort of back to back with the available secondary data and try to analyze the scenario in Sri Lanka. And then I found out that, hold on, there is more than a debt trap. Not a debt trap. Everybody's talking about a debt trap. Now, the debt trap is you give the money and you sort of entangle the country and get them to sort of, work according to their mandate and trap them. So that's a traditional debt trap. But that debt trap goes with quantitative data. So how much of loans have been taken? And then how much and what are these sort of the interest rates and all that. So all quantitative. Then it misses our qualitative factor, which is the strategic trap. Now I coined this one the strategic trap in this book based on three variables. The first is on political funding, which China gives to the country, and I found that during the Rajapaksa regime, there's heavy political funding from the CCP to the SLPP. SLPP is the political party. Now, this was given during the COVID time, the pandemic. And then comes a new kind of a model, alteration of the existing model, which is the democratic model. Now, he was elected democratically, but then he tried to, for the first time again in the Sri Lankan history, he appoints 28 military officers to the civil service, which is the bureaucratic service. The Major General to control prices of food. So this model, when I sort of interviewed a very senior political scientist in Sri Lanka, what he said was, it's closer to Myanmar and Pakistan, but it's a new model in the making. Who's backing it from outside? So then my research goes into who's backing it from outside. There's only one country that backs this model. So I've sort of referenced a phone conversation with President Xi, the Sri Lankan president, where he says that the Sri Lankan president is ready to adopt a new model. So that I found it significant threat to democracy as well as a new model in the making. So all that has been captured, and then what I found was that most of the the political the threat from the political side or the political parties is because of the Gotabaya Rajapaksa's ultra-nationalist sentiments. Now, this you would have to understand very clearly because he comes into power with the Easter Sunday bomb blast, which is a 2019 bomb blast. And then he launched his election campaign 1 week after the bomb blast, saying that, I'm there. He was a former security, he was a Secretary of Defense during the war. So he says, give me the security and I will control. And I come in. So his voter base was the ultra-nationalist, the voter base, which is about 75% of the Buddhist majority, which got into power, managed to. So in that context, everything, the projects are seen from that perspective. Now, this is a very important factor, I think, for the US also, the policymakers here, as well as what happened to the MCC, the US Millennium Challenge Corporation Fund. The 480.
Quickly add, has nothing to do with the Millennium Project. It's not
us. We had this problem of communicating that. So every time I say I'm in Millennium Project, they refer to the FCC. So
We didn't know it.
yes. So the 480 million grant. So the president appoints a committee. I've sort of captured that. And the committee comes up with a report saying there's significant national security threat from the grant. And then I question, I'm writing in Sri Lanka, so I question that what are these committee trying to achieve from this ultra-nationalism, propagating or weaponizing the ultra-nationalism in the country, saying that there was a transport corridor which they were going to build from the MCC US grant. So what they did was they quickly weaponized it, saying that it's a security corridor to transport and for the US to come in and capture the ports as well as create a transport corridor. So Sri Lanka lost the 480 million grant. But unfortunately, the people who were sort of writing for the MCC was people like us in Sri Lanka. But we didn't hear much from the US Embassy in Colombo at that time. That I found, not acceptable, because some of the points that they raised not accurate at all. They're not accurate. So defending, like in Nepal, went through the same cycle, but Nepal managed to get the MCC grant. So there is no US capture or nothing is happening in Nepal. So the ultra-nationalist viewpoint it was used by Gotabaya Rajapaksa with the military, the 28 military appointments as well as the autocratic rule. It's slowly moved to an autocratic. And this has been captured sort of gradually from the political and democratic chapter, where it discussed what happened to a nation. And Daniel Sachs actually quickly picked it up when he read my review. My book, he said, "This is how a nation can, in few months, that can move into an autocratic path." And the tendency is because of the external push and the support from China, where they support on political parties, the human rights, the second factor. When we had concerns from Geneva as well as multiple, Sri Lanka has been sort of struggling to establish, bring in national reconciliation, address human rights issues. But every time we try to do something, we have to veto coming from China and Russia, especially at the UNHRC. So China supports basically the regime's human rights issues, and Gotabaya Rajapaksa's regime. No, this has never happened in our foreign policy. So they had sort of a back-to-back reciprocal understanding. So from Sri Lanka's regime, we basically, his regime, he said that we are supporting the China's human rights issues in Xinjiang. So sort of kind of a reciprocal understanding, and I saw a huge danger there because I used the word bandwagoning for the first time. I mean, I've written pieces on foreign policy, but I've not gone into that extent. So I said, this is a bandwagoning foreign policy. I looked at other countries also, the region, not only Sri Lanka. What are the countries that supporting Chinese policies? Basically in the region, policies on Hong Kong, policies on Xinjiang, on Huawei, and so I found like there are similarities like Maldives, even in East Asia, Laos, so many regional countries. So you would see a regional snapshot, and that's the reason that I was a week ago I was in Singapore talking to the point. So they found the East Asian also found that the book is, I mean, it's relevant to some of the stuff that's going on in Singapore's neighborhood also. Yeah, so basically, the importance of Sri Lanka is discussed right throughout the book. One factor I will mention, and I think I will stop there. So about Winston Churchill's quotation on Sri Lanka during the battle where the Japanese invasion after the Pearl Harbor, you have an attack to Sri Lanka, and Winston Churchill calls it that this is a moment because because of Sri Lanka's geostrategic location, where the Japanese troops can actually, if they won the Sri Lankan battle, their westward sort of invasion would succeed. And that's a decisive moment. I bring in sort of the detailed map of the Japanese attack, how it happened, and how the British forces actually managed. And then quickly move to the present, Shinzo Abe. So you would see sort of abrupt stops, like bring history, but then stopping it because of the word limits, the limitations. So I bring in Shinzo Abe's Indo-Pacific discussion. So now you have Japanese talking about the values, the Indo-Pacific, rules-based order, and you see sort of what has happened to the world right now and what is required, how Sri Lanka should sort of commit to a rules-based order and how it can benefit from all these countries. I sort of mentioned about sandwich between the BRI and the Pacific. So Sri Lanka is, we have the Belt and Road and then the Pacific. Then we are kind of sandwiched between. Then bring in the binary, choices that countries, smaller countries like us get, choose us or them. Then I quickly adjust it to a middle path strategy. We can work with middle countries like nations, middle power nations, and so there is a lot in it, and so I hope you enjoy it.
Hope, first of all, that you get all of your colleagues in the Department of Defense to read this. And maybe they can get State Department to read this. And the homework assignment I would give them with Asanga coaching along the side is what are the leading indicators for this book? We have economic leading indicators. Big deal, we use it all the time. But I don't know if we have leading indicators of taking over countries through invisible means or various other means. It would be interesting if we could create either an index or some sort of leading indicators. Maybe the U.S. government could work on that. A second comment is I can understand the U.S. responding and other countries. It's based upon, in my judgment, I'm not saying we've got to change what we're doing right now, but it's based upon the idea of zero-sum geopolitical power. So if China increases a problem in a country, does that increase its power? And then therefore the other power is going to respond. You've got this zero-sum relationship. Your gain is my loss. My gain is your loss. As long as we have that, I see conflict inevitable in every potential form of the future. And not getting and not ending. As it comes up some science fiction in there. So what I like to see is the possibilities of looking at synergetic relations. Is there any way, for example, the United States and China have a synergetic relationship? Well, one, of course, is climate change. That's an obvious one. Hasn't done it yet, but it's an obvious one. The other one, less obvious, is maybe on future forms of artificial intelligence management governments. There's a lot of kinds of synergies that haven't been explored yet. And nobody heard that. Is that he's also, didn't mention, he's also in charge of a consortium of South Asia countries. That's here, remember. The idea, one of the ideas, is aside from having maybe say the future index for the region, but also do a little matrix. You say each country down one side and the other countries from the top. Say, well, what's the synergetic relationship of India, Sri Lanka, from Sri Lanka to India, from Sri Lanka to Afghanistan, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't know if the Defense Department would be interested in that sort of paradigm shift, but I think that certainly lessons should be drawn from this. I want everybody to read it. But also leading indicators. And then how do we get out of that game? Because as your friendly neighborhood futurist, the future weapon systems are not something you want to mess around with. So it's a bad future if we continue the zero-sum politics. So this book is a great lesson for us to change somehow.
So one day people were just talking about, you talk about GRI and so earlier, whenever countries had problems with China, the rest of the world seems to be like 2 years behind. Right? Earlier, I mean, Western countries would say, well, it's not our fault. Now China's becoming everything. So the US, Canada, and Europe, they all have, big strategies. We also have obviously have the law. But they all have the stated aim of ensuring free and fair in the Pacific. Like, nobody wants to state the obvious that it is about countering China to quite an extent. And at a recent press conference here at the National Press Club, the Japanese ambassador, when he was previewing the G7 summit, said that we're looking to a closer alignment of the G7 approach to China. And now, as you all know, the Quad domestic political considerations by the and Jeff, you mentioned the importance of understanding what's going on in the region and listening. But is it will really listening?
So I think the perception of is really important. That's what I hear, what I see from East Asia. For example, I was in Thailand. They had a conference. The former Thai foreign minister mentioned that completely very different to what being discussed here. Ukraine. Said that Russia should be left alone. It should stop. That the aggression going on, NATO aggression should stop. This is Thailand. PTLI of the United States, former foreign minister on record. So what we discuss here, the perception, the Washington perception, is quite different perceptions that come in other parts of it. Countries like, for example, India, they have this, the non-aligned concept built into the foreign policy. So Sri Lanka also a non-aligned nation. India has a strategic autonomy policy, which is basically that they would not get into big power conflicts and they would get into that non-aligned conflict zone. Which has happened. You see many, look at the ASEAN countries, only Singapore who has taken stance on Russia, on Ukraine and Russia. So other countries sort of neutral. The perception that's coming from those countries about Indo-Pacific is very important, as well as about BRI. I think understanding that is key, because here is a perception coming from Sri Lanka about the BRI and about the Indo-Pacific. I looked at the European Indo-Pacific document, and the EU office in Sri Lanka gave me a copy that was there. And when I had a look, I saw a very diplomatic approach taken, not naming China as an aggressor, and looking at a more trade-oriented approach, and a very clever approach, I would say. So I'll be discussing this book in Paris a few weeks from now. French, I would say one of the first papers I wrote about it was about the French influence in the Indian Ocean and how important that is. Where I was invited to Paris and I discussed the importance of European countries being in the Indian Ocean, especially, and playing a role rather than sort of giving everything or the security challenge to the United States. There should be like consortium. There should be multiple players. We live in a multipolar world. We all agree on, not a unipolar moment or the world that we used to live, but it's a multipolar world. Many countries are important. Their strategies, their foreign policies, their perceptions are important. So why not bring all of them and sort of get into some sort of a standard or what Biden administration, to give you one example, the IPEF, the Pacific Economic Framework, which is building standards to supply chains, building to trade. That's what we need, because here is agreement signed during weekends on a Sunday. The Sri Lankan government doesn't sign agreements on weekends, but we have managed to sign agreements with China on weekends. Closed door ceremonies, no standards. So standards are really important, especially on supply chain. So it's more of it's a complex dynamic, not sort of one particular point. The question has various sort of, I would say, challenges. And supply chains are key when it comes. And East Asia also looks at trade first. We look at the ASEAN and China free trade agreement. China's already signed it, so they're moving forward. And ASEAN countries are entangled with the supply chain, the trade, China. So I think I see almost all the US is always jolted out in conflicts from their comfort zone, and even in Russia and Ukraine, they take. You can see the involvement of US, but then there is a paper which I have sort of done with the Moscow Defense Conference that's been captured in this book, and I even mentioned about strategic alliance, mentioning that how US and Russia fought in the Second World War together with China. There could be, although the context is different, you have two powers rising, India and China. The context is completely different from the Second World War, but then you can draw some lessons of them.
Well, I'm not going to really add much. I'm going to do the normal, obviously I'm just too period here. This is just little Jeff's viewpoints. I will try to recommend the book, but I can't promise anything. But I will say in terms of narratives, and this is one of the things I liked about the book, it points out the narratives. There have been issues with the US and the narrative. Is the US in the region? Is it listening? Yes. You can see that from the sheer amount of programs of bilateral, multilateral, minilateral engagements the United States is a member of. The issue is that we suffer from a problem of time. People think about the immediacy and not a longer time frame, and that shapes the narrative. And then secondly, we're dealing with a country, if we're talking about China, that is vainglorious to the extreme. Like they do a simple contribution that is dwarfed by other possible investments by other countries, but suddenly banners fall from the sky. There are airplanes marking up like "Thank you, China," et cetera, et cetera. And it creates this perception that we're new, we're rising, we're nimble. The U.S. and the West is slow, it's old, it's not catching up, it can't keep up. That's fine, but narratives change, and narratives can change based upon the perception of the region. And I think that is what Asanga is getting to, and what the book highlights is how the narrative is changing in Sri Lanka, how it's going to change in ASEAN, it can change in Pakistan, it can change in the Philippines. I mean, just think about the transition from the Duterte regime to the Marcos regime, and everyone is expecting Marcos to say, "Hey, everything is going to be great with China," and then suddenly the SCS played up, and that's the one thing I'll end with. The US and the way that narrative is being approached is all it's doing is saying that the standard should be standard, that everyone follows the same set of rules, and we do what we do in the sunlight. And for example, this is illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. And China has the world's largest overseas fishing, and they continuously use it as both a method of statecraft and as a huge illegal operator, illegally catching fish and the exclusive economic zones of other countries. When it's highlighted, suddenly, how dare you? This isn't the case. But over time, because the region made the narrative, not the US, China now admits, okay, yeah, we do it. But so do other countries. So it's not like, it's just us. But again, it's about how narratives and time.
I think the warning signs were ignored. You can see multiple, I sort of reference to several warning signs. The Chinese spy ship that came to Sri Lanka is a very good example where New Delhi has serious reservations on that. So why you invite a spy ship to your port? Security threat for the entire region. So Colombo started denying it, the arrival, but then declining the arrival, but then eventually has to invite the ship because of the Chinese significant influence. So the ship came before the balloons came here. That's sort of the hybridity of the ship is known as a research vessel. So it's not, although it has defined components and the hybridity of the warning signs of multiple warning signs of the
Asanga, in your book, you talk about BRI projects, and they're not as advantageous as the air culture. And you give several examples of projects in Vanuatu, Indonesia, Myanmar, Pakistan, Mongolia, and Azerbaijan. In Ecuador, for example, you mentioned that China gets to keep 80% of the oil, and Chinese creditors. You mentioned in your book, Zambia, and China's taken over Zambia's mining assets as collateral. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about debt trap and strategic trap she mentioned. And there have been articles and publications, such as the Atlantic, saying, debt trap is not legal, right? And I think the Chatham House report that you mentioned, but you provided rebuttals to all this. Talk about that.
Yeah, the Chatham House report is correct. And I go point by point. The Chatham House report says the military vessels can't enter Hambantota. I was the Director General of the National Security Think Tank. I interacted with the Navy of Sri Lanka. The military vessels can enter Hambantota. The Yangon 5, which is a spy ship, did enter Hambantota. I found this, the debunking of the debt trap, after the pandemic, so sort of post-pandemic narrative that came in from several Western think tanks, saying that there's no debt trap. While we were saying, our respective country, there is a debt trap, clearly, and see where it's going. I mean, if you look at the article coming on article, clearly mentioned that Sri Lanka is this model with the autocratic and model, the heavy autocratic model is heading towards a crisis, which happened 6 months after the article was written. So it's a clear sort of a prediction on the projects. There's an article on Solomon Islands that clearly highlight what's going on in Solomon Islands and in Sri Lanka. When I wrote it initially, this was to a Swedish think tank, but then Solomon Islands is far away to Sri Lanka. But then I wasn't sure whether I should bring this comparison. But I put the challenge of comparing the industries, how the elites were captured by Chinese in Solomon Islands and how the elites in Sri Lanka were captured. So you see the elite capturability as well as the political plus how they sort of maneuver very well. Chinese have not lost a single project in Sri Lanka for the last 10 years. There have been, all the projects they have managed to successfully win. US have lost projects, Japanese have lost projects. The interesting part of the book is one particular project, the East Container Terminal, where the protesters start talking about geopolitics. The union leaders, then I start seeing what they're trying to say about this. Why are you against this project? Union leaders usually talk about wages, about some issues. You don't talk about geopolitics. So the union leader says, look, we are concerned of geopolitics. That's why we are against this project. This project should not go to India and Japan. Then we found that I quote the Indian foreign minister, of course, been correct on that observation, where the unions also had sort of the connection, also supporting the Chinese project. So you would see tremendous levels of strategic trust, which I mentioned, being sort of built in these countries. You can't, right now in 2019, when I was writing in 1920, saying this is happening, this is going to happen, these are the data that's been captured. And some of the messaging, the signals I got, DoD for clear, of course, they saw a significant threat. Pentagon reports clearly highlights these operations can be used for forward logistics basis. But then some of the signals were wrong coming from Washington. And some of those signals were saying, let it grow. I'm on record on one of the discussions or presentation I had. So one officer was saying, let it grow, let it grow. What do you mean let it grow? Let China grow. There was a strategy which is incorrect, absolutely incorrect back then. I think that Chinese presence to grow in these countries. And then there was another strategy coming in saying that this is a significant national security threat, which is exactly what's written in the book. And so some of the analysts as well as we saw the threat, and so this has to be understood at least now.
As you mentioned, the Chinese is really high interest rates, whereas Japan also has construction projects in Sri Lanka, but their interest rates were much lower.
Yeah, basically the argument is that there's no debt trap because the Japanese loans are equal to Chinese loans, 10%. This is the quantification, so the numbers. But look at the 10%. Are they equal? The Japanese loans are not on 6.2%. Not on high interest. They are not opaque. They're transferred. Some of the loans, right now there's a serious issue of restructuring the debt because of the effects of the loan. So Sri Lanka is going through this.
And I just want to mention one anecdote. One of my colleagues at Global Strat reported extensively from and on Sri Lanka. He interviewed in his office right back in the day. His office was filled with bottles of Chinese food. So, very heavily pro-China. So, you mentioned Solomon Islands, and so Panama in 2017 switched their diplomatic relations from Taiwan to China, and Solomon Islands became in 2018. And so companies that are doing business in the United States, they are doing the operating in these countries. And these are just two examples. So China's, swooping in on economically weak nations. The cycle of this debt trap, this strategic trap, continues.
Yeah, one of the companies that U.S. listers have highlighted that this company is doing a massive project called Port City Project, which is a developing area which is in the heart of the city, and then they're making a special economic with extra jurisdiction of rights. So what the government back then gave to China was a piece of land with extra jurisdictional rights to China, which I saw a significant security part of basically right next to the port of Colombo. So they have the southern port for 99 years. Then they have the most important port right next to that, the massive city and the special economic. So I call it the Phoenix nest, that article, comparing to all the special, I mean, there's about 16 of them are sort of listed. What are the benefits of the other special economic zone, other parts of like in Djibouti? I have referenced touch roads, special economic zone developed by Chinese. So a few months after that, then you have the military base saying that they need to protect their assets and their operations in Djibouti, so therefore we need the military base. So the pattern is quite similar, and this particular piece was captured by Harvard School of Economics, and I did this saying that the phoenix comes when the nest is being prepared. So you're waiting for the phoenix to arrive, and this because when I interviewed the director general, I mean he was the managing director of the port city, Chinese. I interviewed him, and when I asked him about this project that you're building, then he on the Belt and Road and project, he said, no, this is not a Chinese project. So I said, what do you mean it's not a Chinese project? You have Chinese flags in there, the Chinese development is going on. So he said, who said it's a Chinese project? Then, okay, he's on record, and so I'm taking the notes down. This is the international project. The US company is going to come in. The EU is going to, most of the European Union is going to come in. This is an international project. We are just looking after the land, taking care of the land, and then, so up to now it's been 4 years since that interview, so there's not a single plant, or they have not found any business in that particular project. So there's something going on. That's why there's a strategic reason. Even in the other places that I mentioned. So that I mean, there is no economic return on. There is obviously you'd have to think that there's a long-term. That's what I tried to sort of capture, from those interviews. And yeah, so it's clear that not only in Lanka, in Pakistan, clearly 40 billion in drones, the CPEC corridor has been built. So I would see that these projects have a significant security threat for their own country, as well as an economic crisis coming in to repay, or even repay.
You also mentioned the question of who becomes private value and Chinese support. Chinese taking advantage of weak economies, corruption in government, in Sri Lanka, and have other places to subjugate those nations and make them strategic track continue.
Corruption is the biggest issue. IMF Sri Lanka is in a bailout package, so I think it's one of them. We if you look at it, one of the main pillars conditions that bring in is corruption, anti-corruption. Because again, one example in the book is basically the bribery commissioner tried to investigate a project, and then he's been removed, he's been changed. There's a significant political influence. There's no independence of the institution. The structural changes done by the executive president, 4 structural changes, 10 years. Impact of the SOEs, the state-owned enterprises, independent institutions. So the corruption factor, you have a regime coming in 2015, suspending several Chinese projects. They are going to investigate. He will tell you how much money is being lost. Our former president on record this saying, so X amount of millions are missing from one particular project, Lotus Tower. it's the tallest communication tower the tallest tower in South Asia is in Sri Lanka. It's called the Lotus Tower. So on the top of that, there is a antenna installed by the Chinese people. It's a big issue of concern, a security concern for India. But then there's a corruption also in this project. So you have suspensions of this project. Then I write these articles saying that the dragon can never be investigated. So I'm kind of challenging the Prime Minister who's trying to do this, investigate. And I'm saying, how are you going to do this? Because, I know that the Chinese capturability was so strong that they can't get into an investigation. Then a few months after that, his statement saying, I will expose all the corruption. A few months after that, he goes to the Belt and Road, the event. It is a big event, so he goes to China. And he comes back and he says, Belt and Road is the best thing that has happened. And that's it. So basically, all the suspension that was lifted. There's no investigation done in any of the time. So corruption remains as a significant issue.
So what are some solutions for people to resolve the corruption problem? Like, should there be international pressure to basically tell China that you have to have higher standards to stop that type of corruption where you're take like that money?
That's a very good question. Thank you for that. Definitely. So you need to bring in some standards. IMF is actually working on that. The many think tanks have sort of produced like Asia Society, I mentioned the BRI toolkit. But one of the questions I had was when I was developing, like, okay, are the Chinese going to listen? I mean, you have the toolkit, but then will they listen? Will they adopt this toolkit? So it's up to the international. You need international support in countries like Sri Lanka. You don't have that muscle to sort of investigate the Chinese projects, so that is required, and it can come from because Indo-Pacific, like you look at the initiatives right now, the Pacific Economic Framework has corruption pillars. Those are really important areas that State Department as well as they can push. Having, for example, Sri Lankan people have not seen none of the lease agreement, the 99-year lease agreement which I was talking. The public has not seen. So transparency. So we have the Right Information Commission, and so now they have to challenge the government actually. Let the people of Sri Lanka see the fourth city, at least the fourth city document, which I mentioned, the economic zone. So why are they not transparent? So I think the international pressure is required.
One of the things I don't know if you've had it yet, but for those who don't know, transparency is organized as a centralized system. And they have, I don't know how many countries, we have local chapters. And the local chapters have tremendous guts. These are the people, my judgment, on real front line. It's one thing for us to go to a conference and have some nice wine and go home. Transparency people are in the country. They're the ones walking around, going around, what are the risk of certifying this and so forth. For those of you who have not gone through the list of actions, transparency and put together a painstaking experience. And then to back to the question, do you know if Sri Lanka has a chapter of transparency?
They've highlighted all this.
Good. Let's invent a couple of shekels inside it. Inside their buffers.
You're all talking about corruption, and it occurs to me that corruption involves people getting large trunkloads of money, and so they have to put that money someplace, and where they're putting that money is in Western banks and protected places, including, I think, South Dakota or someplace like that. And as long as the Western countries talk a whole lot about corruption in other countries and continue to make many millions of dollars on the money that's stolen and dropped in our banks and things. And until we deal with that money issue, which is corruption issue, there's nothing going to stop it ever. And I'd also like to point out that if you know Korean history, the Chinese have used the same technique in Korea by overtaking their paper industry and their celadon China industry and removing the threat of them like murdering all the Koreans in order to maintain that. So they've been doing it for 600 years or longer. It's their kind of modus operandi of how they do it.
I think that I can, on the money laundering, see some of the autocratic leader we had, he was a US citizen. He announced his citizenship and became president. His family, during the crisis and when people are pricing the houses, the properties were surrounded in California. His brother was finance minister who has serious amount of corruption scandals in Sri Lanka, still visits United States. Recently also he did this, and people, here's the thing, what I can sort of still, I'm trying to understand or decode this. So when the crisis did happen, when people were out in the street, when they walked into the president's house and so he escaped from military aircraft to Maldives. US ambassador in Sri Lanka as well as the US was with the people. They was supporting the uprising of the people. Was because they wanted democracy, they want openness, they want transparency. And I know for a fact because I interviewed the people who were in the protest, there was no US hand, or there was, I mean, right now there's nationalists are making a story saying there was some US hand behind the uprisings. There was no US hand because when I interviewed, there was mothers, there were children, they were like, everybody was out there because we had a president who was basically, was made the entire country rule in the military forefront. So there's no connection to that. But what I can't understand is your question, which you raised. They have so much of corruption issues, money laundering issues. I believe that BI also has a file on one of them. So you have this issues. I mean, we have a murder issue, which is an Sunday leader, who was one of the most prominent people we had, journalists who the entire world respected for murder, not their life. Then, I mean, it was, so you have all these accusations and all that, so, but then nothing's been done. Why is that? So it's a serious issue, which people also, I mean, so you have the protests and the demands of the protesters. Everyone I interviewed, they said corruption. Why are the big people are not getting arrested?
And why is their money not being sucked out of them? Because they're in our bank, in this country, in France and Switzerland and all this country.
Yeah, so Dubai was one of the places, former president, and the cases were going on. So they didn't want to disclose the accounts because he was not found guilty. So it's a complicated issue. But then with the international support, I believe you can definitely work. There's about four papers I've written, the Cambridge Financial Journal, on this money laundering issue in Sri Lanka. The latest paper is about highlighting 6 case studies. So if you're interested, so you can read further. They are the best. I mean, the Cambridge Financial Crimes, the team there is about basically the best lawyers in the world come in September on financial crimes. How do we look at Russian oligarchs or all these money? How do we do this? So if they can't do it, I don't think anybody else could work on a strategy. So it's right time that you do something because people are asking, give us the money back. It's stolen.
I want to be the devil's advocate here. I'll sort of bring a different perspective to the discussion. But before I do that, I do want to say Asanga is my tennis guru. He's my tennis mentor. So even if I be a devil's advocate here, but we talked in the morning and we expect good questions. So here you go. French President Emmanuel Macron recently visited China, and after that, he said, "Oh, we want to have a separate relationship with China." Germany wants to. I think German officials also went there. Ukraine and Russia seem to be sort of. I have been reading a little bit of intelligence reports, and it seems like China wants to mediate between Ukraine and Russia. And it has a 12-point agenda as well. And some of the reports say that the former intelligence community officials want the Biden administration to work along with China on that agenda to resolve the war. Africa seems to be moving towards China. And other countries that we talked about, they seem to be, we talked about the debt trap, but the countries and the governments are willing to, accept those loans and accept the trap that comes with it, but they're still doing it. But the recent intelligence leaks, we have come to know that U.S. has been eavesdropping on even its allies. And so it seems like the opinion is shifting. As I said, I'm going to be a devil's advocate here. So my question to you is, it seems like the opinion and sort of this geopolitics is sort of changing. What do you think? What are your views on
Well, you're right on Macron, because that's why I said when you look at the Indo-Pacific strategy from EU, it's a very different perspective coming in through the Indo-Pacific strategy from US. So France will get that trade. Germany, trade is very important for nations, and ASEAN also. That's why I mentioned that. Ukraine war. Here's the thing. My take on it is the total victory part, which I can't understand. I know there's a total victory narrative going on here. The last conversation I attended, I don't agree with that statement. There is nothing called. I don't see a total victory per se in sort of a lens of a geopolitics analyst. But there could be sort of compromise. Some sort of because Russia, if you look at it right now, and China's alignment, I discuss it a bit here. I think that needs to be considered much more. US would need to consider that. So I think some sort of balance would have to be reached out. US should not move out from the earlier strategy, the kissing the ring doctrine, which is working with two parties at the same time. For example, Israel, Saudis. You should not walk out. You should not have sort of lines drawn on autocracy and democracy, because here is a semi-autocracy. Because the problem here is if you find like that, the tangent sort of, it will be difficult to navigate. So my sort of reading on this is to work with all parties. Keep that older version of the disintegrate doctrine. Which is not referring to Henry Kissinger, but Bismarck's foreign policy, working with two at the same time, which US could benefit in this situation. Total victory, I think you need to sort of reduce that a bit. I heard the Ukraine speaking about a US foreign policy, where I actually, I was shocked to see how the Ukrainians see the US foreign policy victory. it doesn't happen like that. Of course. So I think the important to understand that particular narrative. China, I mean, in this case, you can bring it to some sort of standards. That's my appeal here. Basically, have some standards, understand the strategic practice happening. It's happening in countries, but then you can bring it to some standards because it's easier for the international IMF as well as many other international institutions to work. Also, they are already working. It's easier to have some sort of standard. So I think the overall U.S. would I mean, if China is willing to come as a mediator, EU is willing to give that position, and you should give that space. There shouldn't be any. I mean, why would you want to go on a narrative which is like not go into that sort of it's a narrow sort of a corridor that you are getting. You confine into that, saying that should not give a space for China. That is limit your process and politics.
If I can add two things. One, I agree with everything Asanga just said, but China needs to return the US phone calls. That's the second point. So it's not really on us. Beijing needs to figure out. And also it needs to delineate from no one can talk to the US unless she gives permission. The country's too big for one man to run the show. And then secondly, again, narratives. I understand for the narratives, the big things, senior leader to senior leader engagements, massive economic investments, massive military sharing or technology transfers, they make headlines. But the difference is that governance and bilateral relationships are made up of a lot of minuscule on the ground in the weeds projects. And if you compare again, the footprint, say in Africa of what China has done versus what say European powers or the United States sustains with a lot of African nations, it's still nowhere near comparable. You ask pretty much the entirety of like say naval operators around the African littoral coast, who they would rather work with, People's Liberation Army Navy and the Chinese Coast Guard, or the US Coast Guard and the US Navy, they would respond to US Navy, US Coast Guard. The reason being is those institutions are networked. So you work with the US Coast Guard, you're also going to work with the Colombian Coast Guard, you're going to work with the British Coast Guard, you're going to work with the French Coast Guard. The Chinese Coast Guard is going to end the Chinese Coast Guard. You get a multiplier of one versus a multiplier of two.
I have two questions. One very brief. We spoke earlier about comparative synergy of various South Asian states, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, India. I was just curious how you were quantifying that. My other question is that we've talked a lot about foreign policy. We've talked a lot about work policy and foreign capitals, talked a lot about civil service. We haven't talked about domestic opposition very much, aside from the protests, which certainly don't constitute parliamentary, any kind of effective political or parliamentary opposition. What are we missing by not talking about that?
Well, I'll do a quick answer and throw the synergy back. This has never been done. I've been doing futures research for 50 years. Almost every issue you probably think about in every issue. I have never heard anybody say, what is our synergetic relationship with country A or B? Competitive advantage, competitive strategy, competitive intelligence, you bet you. We'll teach you in business schools and diplomacy schools. Synergetic, what does that mean? So, on one hand, let Asanga off the hook. Put back on the hook later. This is new territory. Now, I personally have been doing a little bit of stuff in China on two synergies I was talking about, informally, obviously. But when I use the word synergy, I mean something, as Bucky Fuller, American futurist, said, you take a wheel and a box, you put a wheel in the box, you don't get much. You take the wheel out of the box, you put it underneath the box, you get a wheelbarrow, you get a block. So it's not the cooperation of the box and the wheel. It's a new relationship that makes it was not there before. So if the US and China could make a R&D commitment on climate change and a standardization of artificial general intelligence, it's a new thing, it's a new mechanism in the world. And this is all new stuff. We're just not thinking this way. I don't know a single business school that teaches synergetic relations with other businesses. And I beat up on business schools regularly. I get my hands on it. So to let Asanga off the hook, this is a new idea. It is reinvented. I'm going to have ideas out there. So if it's not done perfectly on the first, second, or third round, at least we get it off and it starts. Now we can back on that.
Yeah, so on the question on the opposition. So what happened in Sri Lanka case, there was opposition. But it was a majority, parliament, two-thirds majority was government. So controlled by the Rajapaksa. So the new president elected, he was not elected, he was appointed. First time we have appointed president, the previous president, went away from the country, so he appointed this particular, the new president, Vikram Singh. But he had only one seat in the parliament. And that was a bonus seat which he got from his political party. So when I asked from a constitutional lawyer, constitutionally accepted because it says in the constitution that the president intends to you sort of vacate the position, and you can appoint a member of the parliament. But would you appoint a person who has one seat? Parliament. So it's actually ethically that you should.
A person, you mean a person whose party holds
only one seat. So the point is this. So he's a British lawyer, so I asked him like, what is the constitutionality of this? Constitutionally accepted, but you should not practice such things. That's what he said. It's written, but then one seat in the parliament becomes obvious. There was an opposition leader who had many seats, and he was the right, but he was not given. So the discussion goes in Sri Lanka saying that president did call him, but he didn't want to take the offer because he didn't want any of the Rajapaksas or the family around. That's the reason that.
Are you saying that Sri Lanka's parliamentary opposition asked for its own defeat?
Sorry?
Are you saying that the opposition asked for its own defeat by refusing Rajapaksa's offer?
Correct. Yeah, correct. Because because what he said was he didn't want any Rajapaksas. I interviewed him actually, the opposition leader. So he said he has principles and he will never have any Rajapaksas around him. And
Can he just unappoint all those Rajapaksas?
the problem, the majority of the parliament belongs to the Rajapaksa party. So it's controlled by. So right now you have a prime minister from that party. So it's kind of a very hybrid model. Again, a very complex situation. But what I'm saying is like, okay, he's appointed, not elected, but he can be appointed for a few months. But then you need people in the election. But the people of Sri Lanka is asking for the election. Now it's been delayed, been postponed. It was supposed to have in April, but it became postponed, so the local election. But then next year you will have the presidential and the parliament election. So one of the issues that the data that's been sort of captured right now is that the leftist parties are much stronger now because of the economic situation that's going on in the country and
To Rajapaksa's favor or against it?
Against Rajapaksa's favor. There's a third coalition called the leftist wing, and the problem is the economic situation, and everybody is suffering. There's a PBS document recently, this 2 days ago, all Sri Lankans are suffering. Okay, children, school children are paying fees this morning to get their food. So you have a serious economic crisis where the leftist parties have said, we will address this because the two parties that have been, in power back to back have been corrupt. So some of the data that I capture right now shows that they are up in the sort of the but a few weeks ago, Sri Lanka is a very, a dynamic place for political activism and all that. So a few weeks ago, there was another book which was released on Sri Lankan crisis, saying this was written by a member of parliament who was very close to the Rajapaksa, accusing US and India of the crisis, and they were part of it, and the intelligence agencies were part of it. So this narrative has been, I think, it's again the ultra nationalists, catering to that as well as getting ready for another election for the Rajapaksas to come back to it.
Is there time for a couple more questions?
Yes.
Mine is not a question, it's a comment. First, I want to introduce myself. I'm here as a guest of Mr. Asanga. Mr. Asanga and I will both attend lectures on books from historical politics and prose. We also live in the same building, and now I'm learning that he's also a tennis player. So what as I said, I'm an Italo-American lawyer. I was born in Rome, and I'm a citizen of both countries, US and Italy. And I practice law out of my office in Rome. We have an office here on K Street, Washington, D.C., and we have a fully staffed office in Caracas, Venezuela. Now, having said this, and hearing that so many people here so knowledgeable about Sri Lanka, I just only want to notice that we Europeans and many Latin Americans, we know very little about Asia. I don't know how we could approach and create some knowledge between these millions of people who live in different atmospheres. We are in the Western Hemisphere here. We know an awful lot about Europe here, but we know very little about Asia and nothing about Sri Lanka, I'm sorry. And today, with the importance of China and India, we feel very at ease because we don't know much about them, and I don't see any solution how we can approach this group.
It's a very important point. Sri Lanka has not been discussed much. That's why I bring in the reference to Winston Churchill. Why it's important. There are only few scholars, even in Washington, speaks about Sri Lanka, and it's. I think we did. There is a huge gap there. Sri Lanka. It was a European, Marco Polo highlighted his travel. Then I mentioned about a Russian also explorer, Konstantin Abeygoonasekera, who comes in. So there's a little reference when I was teaching here Northern Kentucky University. Not a single student in the class knew where Sri Lanka was. One student knew, but she was from Sweden. So I think there is a knowledge of geography as well as important countries. It has to be developed. So one of the requests that I had for the dean university was that please let these kids go to these countries, travel to Asia. You can't sort of decode China from here, so you need to go to China, you need to sort of see Russia again, all these countries. So it's important that they travel. Your question is very important. So you need to bridge that gap.
Yeah, can you elaborate? Can you elaborate more on China and Sri Lanka's growing strategic and economic partnership? It's threat to India. How do you do that?
Well, its threat to India is on the ship visit, for example, I gave an example. So Lotus Tower, the antenna on the top of there is a security concern, which New Delhi has raised, which is, I believe, it's a serious concern. Sri Lankan government needs to give attention. Now that the projects have already commenced and then these things are installed, and how do you sort of bring certain standards? So the new president, he has managed to somewhat balance it. Now the project that I mentioned here, sort of restarted like the Japanese and largely the Indians and Scandinavia. So most of those projects have sort of become, but it's commenced by him, but then you have the majority of the parliament controlled by the party. So there's a big question there, how much sincere are these approaches? The Japanese government has clearly mentioned they're really concerned on back and forth on this project. So, if you look at the geoeconomics perspective, there is a concern for India. I mentioned about building development projects in the northern territory or like the water projects or dam projects. These are serious issues to India's immediate periphery, which is 32 kilometers away. So you have to be concerned about those projects. So I think the importance is that some of the projects that has already been leased out, you can't revisit them. You have to understand that several governments did try to revisit them, so you can't revisit the big sign. Chinese kind of sort of, when they signed the project, they said that no, it's kind of, you can amend it and you can, it's not a hard and fast, but no, these are all strategic directions. So China has achieved that, but India has not achieved the significant influence that is in the country is very clear. And India can't match it because of the amount of funding that will be as well as on infrastructure. You can't match it. But India right now, the first country to come when Sri Lanka was in crisis, gave 4 billion, significant amount. So we have a neighbor, we have to sort of understand what's India's concerns also and navigate. And Sri Lanka can be, easily turned into, because it's 21 million population, small country. Most of you have been Sri Lanka, and ambassador here who served in Sri Lanka on this ambassador. So, it has a huge potential. Has to get its sort of foreign policy balance, get that. Understand New Delhi clearly. And Indian tourism is good enough to make Sri Lanka a very, I would say, lucrative place for tourism as well as they go to East Asia for the Indian tourists. So you come to Sri Lanka, you have just close by. And the largest amount of tourists before the Chinese was India. So arrivals. And the largest trading partner was India, but now China has taken over. So along those areas.
Final question.
So I am also a neighbor of Asanga and a kindred neighbor of Asanga in the sense that I am from Maldives. We're just to the south of Sri Lanka, and there's a lot of parallels between the Chinese engagement with Sri Lanka and the Chinese engagement with the Maldives. And their strategic motives are largely the same. It's because we lie amidst those critical sea lanes of communications that are so critical to Chinese energy supplies from Hormuz all the way to Malacca. And the Chinese are certainly aware of that. So the point is that they have a compelling strategic region to be in the Indian Ocean, and they're not going to go away. And on the other hand, countries like the Maldives and Sri Lanka, we also have a need for infrastructure of investment. Sometimes, yes, those investments are opaque, but we still need them. It's it's the sheer scale of Chinese largesse is very attractive. So how do we balance that attractiveness and the fact that Chinese presence in the Indian Ocean is just going to go keep growing, with also a need to preserve our autonomy and sovereignty. So, like, what lessons can Maldives learn from Sri Lanka in that regard?
Very good question. I mean, read the book. Mibra's work, actually ask you to read his work also in mathematics. I read his pieces. I mean, seeing the perspective of all this, what's going on, is very important. Like he said, the lines of communication that China's damn state, of course, China's damn state, but you can get it into some sort of standards, global norms, rules-based order. They need to follow the rules, and the countries that are there, like the government of Maldives and Sri Lanka, can clearly mention that. Should have the courage to say that. You don't need to sign agreements on weekends and not be transparent about it. I mean, I think China is new to the game. I mean, when I sort of reread my sort of work and look at superpower strategies, let's put it that way. They're new to the game. They need to learn. It's as simple as that. So they need to learn, understand how it has to be sort of played. And China, I think, is learning. For example, I give one example: the port city. Environmental players is not taken early, and they quickly move into sustainable, ways of doing projects and sort of try to quickly implement, certain things, which is really good. The highway, they even created something called. When I was interviewing, I was laughing about it, creating a corridor for the elephants to cross. And this must be the first in the world. I mean, you have something like that. But no, we care about sustainability, which is really good. They are talking about it, but then again, them doing the mistakes over and over again. That's where the problem is. Now, recently I wrote a piece, actually 2 days ago, published again in Sweden about the waterways. We should not do that because you see the one of the main arteries, waterways in Sri Lanka is called the Malwa River, flowing to the west coast. And then they're building a dam there and moving earth and all that. So they don't look at that. They want to sort of do this gigantic project. They have done it in many water projects. Then I found that they have done it in 70 countries, not in Sri Lanka. And some of the projects have serious environmental. So China would need to learn before you sort of get into all these sectors. So all the sectors that all these are going through, Sri Lanka is also going through the same issues. Balancing is what we have. That's the only option countries like us have. Gotabaya Rajapaksa mentioned that I have an equidistance foreign, I will introduce equidistance balanced foreign policy. So then I keep questioning him, what happened to your state? Said balance, but aren't you bad at it? There is a reason why he was doing that. So that's what we sort of discuss in the book. And we need to, I think, maybe the future, significant pressure, of course, coming from. And there is enormous amount of literature on Middle Kingdom, powers that sort of China's projecting. So I think that needs sort of more attention. So the new leaders, I think, requires this geopolitical thinking, geoeconomic thinking. Of course, the future is there. Without that, I don't think any of the leaders can navigate. If you have the leaders who has no understanding of these areas, you will end up getting into either bandwagoning or
So, and copies of the book are available for purchase at the author's for client. Want to thank